of AP Hawkins, talking about different ways that you can construct ecosystems, and many examples through fiction that are out there as far as ways to go about it. Very interested in this, and I love that Anna said she got a little too far into this, was like, oh my gosh, there's so much to talk about. So really happy to have this topic today.
I'm excited to talk to y'all today about biology. A little bit about me, for those of y'all who don't know me. It feels weird saying my first career was in biology, but I guess that's kind of true.
You could say your pedigree.
Yeah, my pedigree, my education. I have a bachelor's degree in marine biology and a master's degree in plant community ecology. And I worked in that field for a couple of years after that before I decided to be a writer and an editor instead. But now I use my knowledge of biology and my first love of biology to help kind of inform my world building and my writing. I have a really great interest in speculative biology. I think it's really cool as like a scientific kind of thought process. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And this is just a picture, I guess biologically relevant picture of a mountain goat that I saw when I was in Glacier National Park several years ago. So that was we saw lots of cool animals there that, we don't have here in Texas. So that was a really cool thing to see. Anyway, so let's jump right into it. So we're going to do some definitions and a little bit of history, and we're going to move into a little bit of a biology lesson. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat, and I'll get to them when I see them. So to start, what is speculative biology? This is the field of hypothetical evolution. It can be hypothetical on Earth or hypothetical on other planets or worlds. If we're talking hypothetical evolution on Earth, this is alternate histories, imagined futures, like an alternate history where there was no natural disaster that killed most of the dinosaurs. And so they were able to keep evolving what they might look like in a future where that never happened, or what the world might look like after humanity goes extinct, what animals might change and grow to fill in those empty spaces that we used to take up, things like that. Or, you can build a whole world that's a completely imagined ecology, environment, animals and plants that may resemble things that you see on Earth, but that don't actually exist, right? So this field, I call it a field loosely, it's generally considered a subgenre of science fiction. It does have, the field of speculative biology does have a basis in real science. So people who think a lot about speculative biology, who like to write a lot of speculative biology, there's this whole subgenre field where these authors and producers and people like that are actually following real scientific principles in order to invent these worlds that they come up with. So this is considered hard science fiction. And while it's generally not super recognized as part of the fantasy genre, you can apply the same principles in fantasy settings as well when you're creating a secondary world fantasy and you need to populate it with animals and plants and insects and fungi and whatever. So the things that we're going to talk about today, we're going to have a mini biology lesson at the end, and don't worry, it'll be really, really easy. But these principles that we're going to talk about are things that when you're building worlds for your writing, you can kind of consider and think about when you're trying to invent, animals and plants to fill your imagined environments. So briefly, the history of speculative biology. This is a very long-standing trope in science fiction. One of the very first books that is kind of recognized as, having speculative biology or having it be important is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, where he has the two further evolved, where humanity further evolved and split into two kind of subspecies. And so that is kind of one of the very first recognized examples of speculative biology. But throughout the 20th century, these were generally, any books with speculative biology, it was generally very small scale and rarely well developed. And so in most of these cases, you would have maybe one animal or one plant and not a fully realized ecology or environment that is being shown on the page. There are some exceptions to this, such as the Barsoom series by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which is, the Princess of Mars books. And those books have a fully realized, imagined environment of Mars and the animals and plants that would have lived there. But the first book that is really considered to be like the epitome of speculative biology is the book After Man by Dougal Dixon. This book includes over 100 fictional animals of Earth in the future after humanity has gone extinct. And this is Dougal imagining what animals might, evolve to fill in spaces that's left behind after humanity's gone. And he actually wrote a lot of speculative biology books after this book, After Man. So if you're really interested in speculative biology, I encourage you to check him out and his books. There's another one, The New Dinosaurs. He wrote that one too. So I encourage you to check out his works if you have an interest in speculative biology, because his stuff is really interesting. But so, like I said before, speculative biology is built on real ecological and biological principles. And obviously, this is as far as we understand them based on Earth's evolutionary history. And this is somewhat recognized as an actual branch of science, or at the very least a educational tool where these imagined scenarios can help illustrate natural processes on Earth. And I mentioned Dougal Dixon's The New Dinosaurs on the previous slide, and in that book, that was in 1988, where paleontology was kind of undergoing a little bit of the field of paleontology was undergoing a little bit of a revolution, where dinosaurs, paleontologists were just starting to think of them less as, slow-moving, lazy animals that drag their tails on the ground, to kind of energetic, fast-moving animals with, different postures that they hadn't been imagined in yet. And the idea of dinosaurs having feathers was just barely starting to show up in paleontological circles. Still not very highly regarded as it is today, but anyway, in The New Dinosaurs, Dougal Dixon incorporated these new paleontological ideas and kind of extrapolated them to extremes. And then, now his dinosaurs in this book, his imagined dinosaurs, more closely resemble what we think of as dinosaurs today than what paleontologists thought of as dinosaurs before 1988. So it's kind of cool that, these, the actual science and the speculative science kind of influence each other and work together to help inform our own knowledge of biology and these natural processes. There's another really cool example of an artist actually predicting the existence or the behavior of a prehistoric creature. So in 2013, John Mazaros imagined this creature called Psittacarus, which is here in this image here. And he imagined it as this swimming filter feeder that, would eat microorganisms in the ocean. And then the very next year, paleontologists discovered a very similar prehistoric creature that would have been a filter feeder. And they ended up naming it after its imaginary counterpart that, existed before it did.
So let me ask, Anna, is this a picture from John Mazaros, or is this the image of like a scientific image?
Yeah, so this is not a scientific image. This is not John Mazaros's image. This is another artist's reimagining of the imaginary critter Psittacarus. But the actual real life fossil that they found that ended up being named after this creature does look very strikingly similar. And I wish I found, when I was looking for this image, I did find some side-by-sides of the recreation of the fossil, artistic recreation of the fossil versus the imagined creature. And they do look very strikingly similar. They both have these long, filterous jaw things that they're not really jaws, but they're kind of I hesitate to describe them as being like baleen, but that's kind of what they're like. They're just, kind of like little filters that catch other organisms and then the animal then eats them. They both have those kind of coming off their front end. And so it's really interesting that, because I had another writer's lunch where I talked about how science fiction writers have several times throughout history have predicted future technology before it existed. And so this is a case of the same thing happening just from a biological perspective. So when you apply, scientific principles, an artist applying the same principles as a scientist could come to the same conclusion, or a very similar conclusion that the scientist would come to. So it's really interesting to kind of think about that. There's a lot of stuff going on in the chat. Okay, no actual questions, but yes, I love the commentary. But yeah, After Man is a really cool book, Sean, and yeah, Samuel Delaney. Yeah, cool. All right. So continuing on. So now how does this, we've talked a little bit about, earth-based, quote, earth-based speculative biology, but what about extraterrestrial life and astrobiology and xenobiology? So this field of astrobiology is generally held as separate from speculative biology because it's like, oh, astrobiology is actual science and speculative biology is fiction. But they follow the same general principles. So I think they're more similar than a lot of people would like to admit. Astrobiologists are doing the same things that speculative fiction writers are doing, where they're taking scientific principles as we understand them and applying them to worlds that are different from Earth. That's all. And, imagining what life might exist in a world like that. So when you're looking at extraterrestrial life and worlds that are very different from Earth, you have different things that you have to consider beyond just biology. You have to consider chemistry and physics as well. On Earth, life on Earth is carbon-based because Earth chemically is very carbon-rich. But other worlds do not have as much carbon and are rich in other kinds of, oh my God. What?
Elements.
Yes, thank you, Shannon. God, my brain just other worlds are rich in other elements besides carbon. So you might have a world that has a lot of silica or silica compounds, and if life evolved on that world, instead of being carbon-based, it might be silica-based instead. And so what would life look like if it was all built on silica compounds? Or if you have life on a gas giant where there's no actual rock or geology, there's just layers of gases at different pressures. And so what might life look like on a planet like that? And there's, I don't know if it's really famous, but there's a thought experiment by Carl Sagan and another scientist where they were imagining life on a gas giant and what it might look like. And they came up with this idea of floaters, sinkers, and hunters. So floaters that would float in the higher reaches of the atmosphere where the air is less dense, sinkers that would sink down to the very dense levels, and then hunters that could travel between the dense and less dense layers and, pick off critters that they find wherever they find them. So yeah, there you can consider other things besides just biology, or what might a mammal look like on a different planet? What might on a different carbon-based planet? What might a mammal, quote, analog, right, look like on a planet that's all silica compounds, where life is not even based on the same, base elements that it is here? All right, so we're going to look at some examples in media before we get into the actual biology lesson. And so I'm going to preface this with, these are the ones that I have here as examples are not necessarily my favorites, but they're the ones that I'm the most familiar with in terms of, and ones that I think are actually really good examples of this science-based speculative biology in media. So we're going to start with some visual media because it's a lot easier to get across this speculative biology in media. It's a lot easier for it to be front and center in a visual media than it is in a book. So we're going to start with James Cameron's Avatar from 2009 and its sequel that I have not seen. But this movie was very formative for me in terms of my interest in speculative biology. I saw this movie in theaters 4 times, okay? And I know it has faced very valid criticism. The story's not great. There's some really problematic tropes in there. That's all very valid. The visuals are absolutely stunning. And this whole fully realized world that has been invented here, the biology of this world is very interesting. And in my opinion, it's well thought out and, it's just a really good example of speculative biology, in my opinion. And in this world, the main kind of biological principle that is important here is cooperation between species. The species on this world have ways of communicating with each other, telepathically or, otherwise. And so that's kind of like the main biological principle that's kind of comes out in this movie is cooperation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's really interesting to see that play out on screen in terms of this world and how it affects the humans who come to this world as well. And, and then the movie has some kind of cool eco-fiction themes in there as well. So definitely, take it with a grain of salt in terms of like the plot and the tropes, but watch it for the cool speculative biology that you'll see. So it definitely has value as a movie. Another interesting example is Alien Worlds from 2020. This is a speculative docuseries, and I believe it's still on Netflix. I watched it a couple years ago, back when it was on Netflix, and I think it's still on there. So they consulted actual like astrobiologists in this. So for this docuseries, they were consulting scientists and like definitely based all of the biology in this docuseries on science. And it essentially, it's just 4 episodes. And so each episode focuses on a different planet. And it imagines what life might be like on these exoplanets with very different properties than Earth. So there's, ones that have higher or lower gravity, different atmospheric compositions, other things going on that could really influence how life develops on these planets. And it just applies, biological principles, again, as we understand them, because our understanding of biology is always evolving and changing as we learn more, to create, these kind of fully realized ecosystems. So this is a really, and it's, and it's in the style of a nature documentary. So it's narrated, it's all CGI, but I think this is a really cool example of science-based speculative biology. So definitely check that out. Scavenger's Reign, that came out in 2023. I'm actually watching this right now. So if you have watched it, do not spoil it for me, please. I'm on episode 5, I think. But this follows humans that have been stranded on an unknown planet. But something that's really cool about it, even though it's following these groups of humans and there is like a plot that's building up surrounding these humans, it spends a lot of screen time focusing on this world that they've found themselves in that's just absolutely teeming with life. And so like I've been watching this show and I'm like, dang, this is a really good biology lesson in a show if you're watching for it. And you have to be watching for some of the biological principles that they include here. But if you're watching for it, you'll see it. I mean, there's parasitism going on. There's clear examples of coevolution, mutualisms, just interactions between species, and then how the species on this planet are trying to interact with the humans that show up in like a normal way for them, and then how that affects the humans as well. So it's really cool show. Definitely recommend watching it. It's on Netflix now. It started on HBO Max, but they decided they didn't want to continue with it, and so now Netflix has it. So that's why I get to watch it. And as the story goes on, it builds this kind of cool ecological mystery. So I'm really into this. I really hope they do a second season because it's really cool show. All right, now getting into books. One really cool speculative biology kind of book, and this is more on the fantasy side. This is the Memoirs of Lady Trent series by Marie Brennan, and it's part natural history speculative text and part fictional memoir. And so it's following the discoveries of Lady Trent, this famous dragon naturalist. And there's a lot of really cool, biological illustrations of dragons in there. A lot of really cool, theorizing about different species of dragons and, their biology and how they kind of fit into their environments and stuff. And I mean, this is the cover of the first book. This is why I picked it up. I didn't know anything about this book when I picked it up. I just saw this cover of this anatomy sketch of this dragon, and I was like, oh, this is going to be a really cool book. So, and it's a 5 or 6 book series, so definitely check those out if you like. And it's set in a Victorian-esque world where dragons exist, essentially. So, if you like fantasy and you like historical fiction and you're interested in biology, this is a really cool book for you to pick up, a really cool series. Another really cool one that I have started reading recently, I've only read the first book, but I I am in love with it and I can't wait to read the rest. This is the Tide Child trilogy by R.J. Barker, and it's a really cool kind of imagining of how ecology affects people. And so in these books, you have humans who are kind of dependent on dragons for a lot of the things that a lot of like their society and culture and things like that. They depend on dragons and like the byproducts of dragons. So like, you know, they live in an archipelago, so they have to sail between the archipelago, and they don't have wood to build ships. And so the only like material that is strong enough that they have access to build ships out of is dragon bones. And so, you know, for centuries or thousands of years or whatever, they've been building their ships out of dragon bones and, hunting dragons and, whatever. And then all of a sudden the dragons disappear. And so then there's a plot kind of centers around this ecological mystery of like, okay, the dragons are gone. We haven't seen one in a really long time, but oh, here's one that shows up. And so where's it going? Why is it here? Where is it going? Where did it come from? And so the plot kind of centers around that ecological mystery and that dependency that humans have on dragons and, how they interact with their world. And so I think this is a really cool, it's a little bit, I don't want to say sparse in terms of the speculative biology, but it's like it's not a super fully realized world, right? That's populated with things that are really unfamiliar, like you would see in the Avatar movie or in Scavenger's Reign, but it is a really cool kind of exploration of interactions between species and, what happens when, like a keystone species, which I'll talk about later, what happens when they disappear. So these are really cool books. Highly recommend. If you like pirates, if you like dragons, check it out. It's very cool. Dragon Riders of Pern is another one that is also a little bit different. Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. This whole series kind of centers around humans who have bioengineered dragons to cooperate and communicate with them. And in these books, there's always this kind of threat of an interplanetary biological ecological disaster where this substance called thread falls out of the sky when their planet's orbit passes too close to this other planet that thread comes from. So there's always this threat of ecological disaster that is kind of hanging over their heads in these books. The biology does kind of tend to fade into the background. The bioengineering stuff, I didn't read the first book in this series until after I had read several other books in this series. And so I didn't realize, because the later books are mostly fantasy and they kind of don't talk about how the dragons came to be, which is through science and bioengineering. And so I didn't realize that, that was the origin of this until I went back and read like the first two books. And I was like, oh my God, they actually like created these dragons themselves, and they came from a very scientifically advanced society to this planet. So yeah, this is a really cool book with some, interesting, takes on biological principles that are coming in. And then the last one that I have, this one is a little different. This is the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. This is a still from the Annihilation movie. But these books focus on biological change. So not so much on like the biology itself, right, and how it's different, but on how it's changing and becoming different. And like throughout these books, we have a specific event sets off rapid mutations in DNA that makes animals and plants turn into weird stuff. And this biological mystery of like why is this happening? What set it off? And can we stop it? Whatever. This is central to the plot. It's very trippy. We've got unreliable narrators. There's eco-horror. These are cool books. They can be a little bit hard to get into just because they're a little weird. But yeah. But this one, if you want to read about biological change and how, changes in DNA can kind of accumulate and cascade and cause other changes to happen, then these are really cool books to read. And definitely, even if you don't want to read the books, definitely check out the movie, because I thought the movie was really good as well. All right. So we're about halfway through, so that's good. So we got some stuff in the chat. People liking Pern, liking Jeff Vandermeer. Yeah. Rhonda says the Rampart Guards were the result of failed genetic tinkering toward Pern's dragons. Yeah, they had some false starts and some problems that they had, creating these dragons. So
I wanted to bring this up, Anna. Sorry.
Yeah.
The idea that speculative biology goes all the way back to the Greeks and that first sci-fi novel ever written. I'm going to forget the name of it, but it's called like A Journey or something like that. And basically, it is a man who goes to the moon, and there are moon people, and there are giant spiders that live there. But then he goes to, like hang out on the sun, I think hang out on other planets like Mercury. So, like, for sure, taking things that exist in the world and then just somewhat modifying them, like has been with sci-fi totally since the beginning.
Oh, forever. I mean, people have been, imagining creatures, since the beginning of time or before that, I think. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's,
Herodotus, yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Herodotus's histories and how he just made up, like people who have one foot and poke their head into the ground like an ostrich and like all sorts of strange humans. Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, there's, some people think that, where the idea of mythological dragons came from is from, prehistoric humans finding dinosaur fossils and not knowing what they were and just creating this creature of a dragon based on, they find this, massive skull with these big old teeth that are like a foot long. And they're like, what creature could this possibly have come from? And they are telling stories and they imagine, essentially a dragon. So
I loved the mammoth skulls that they've compared to the
Cyclops.
The Cyclops, yes.
Yeah.
And how the hole for a trunk looks like a giant eye socket. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, if you've ever seen mammoth or an elephant skull, they essentially, they're basically round, right? And they have this giant hole like right in the center where, obviously that's, we know that's where the trunk comes from. But, to people who didn't know, had never studied elephant anatomy before, may have never even seen an elephant or a mammoth before in their entire, lives or histories, you see a giant hole in a skull and you're like, oh, that's got to be the eye, right? Because like the actual eye sockets for elephants and mammoths were really small,
They look like ear holes, like
yeah, they look like ear holes, and they're on the side, and it's like so yeah. I mean, yeah, it's really cool. I mean, looking at just like studying animal like anatomy and skeletal structure and like the similarities with humans and like how those structures might be misinterpreted by people who don't know what they are, especially when you don't have the animal to compare a skeleton to. So yeah. All right. So we're going to have a little mini science lesson now. We're going to talk about some biological principles, some very simple ones. Don't worry. This is going to be very simple. We're not going super in depth. This is just like an overview of a few evolutionary principles that, if you want to, delve more into speculative biology and create more realistic animals and plants and insects to kind of fill your imagined worlds with, these are some things that you can consider or, read more about and, use them in your own fiction. So, well, if I can get my slide to advance. Okay, so why bother? So I kind of mentioned earlier, in books, speculative biology, when it's not central to the plot, it often kind of fades into the background. It becomes scenery, right? But having it there, it makes your invented worlds feel more real. If you have your characters in, like a secondary world fantasy and all the plants and animals are the same as what we have on Earth, it doesn't feel so much like a secondary world than it does if, they, maybe some familiar ones, but, some unfamiliar animals and plants and things that they occasionally see or interact with. It can make the world feel more distinct. And, if you, plot relevant speculative biology can lead to really interesting stories. Like we talked about with, the Annihilation trilogy, the Tide Child trilogy, you can get some really interesting ideas for stories when some aspect of speculative biology is central to the plot. And, like I said, making your speculative fiction feel more realistic only requires a very basic understanding of biology or of biology and evolution. So we're going to talk about a few little evolutionary principles. So the first, to start, what is evolution? That is its most basic definition. Evolution is how organisms change over time. And time here is millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, billions of years. Evolution takes place over massive timescales. It doesn't happen overnight. There are a rate of evolution, can be faster or slower, depending on the selective pressures that a species is subjected to. And we will talk about that in the next slide. But generally, evolution happens over very long periods of time. And how it happens is a accumulation of mutations and adaptations in the creature's DNA in response to, everyone's heard of natural selection, in response to natural and artificial selection. So natural selection is things like your environment, your predators, your mainly environment, predators, pollinators, things like that, natural selection. Artificial selection is things like, we breed dogs to different dog breeds. That's artificial selection. We're specifically taking dogs, and we're taking specific dogs and breeding them with other specific dogs to get traits that we want in their offspring. So that's artificial selection. And so, things like that. So selective pressures that critters and plants face can reduce or increase their reproductive success. And if an animal or a plant has increased reproductive success, that means the traits that they have are passed down more often to the next generation and can accumulate in that population as they spread around because they're more favorable than another member of that same species who doesn't have those traits. Does anyone have questions so far? Does this make sense? Because I don't want to lose anybody. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions pop up, so I think this makes sense so far. All right, so we're going to talk about some examples of selective pressures. This is not an exhaustive list. Again, this is just a few examples. I think I found some really good images that can show kind of what this means. Some things are popping up in the chat. Ian says we're locked in. All right, good. Okay, so Sean said that moth just tricked me. Yes, that's what I'm about to talk about.
Two snakes, bro. Two snakes.
Yes. So predation can be a very strong selective pressure towards certain traits. An animal that stands out or that looks defenseless is going to get preyed on by a predator way more often than one that looks less defenseless. So a good example of this, atlas moths. This is an atlas moth. They have evolved to mimic snakes. This mimicry on their wings here, these two snake heads on their wingtips, they scare off birds that would predate on the atlas moth, or they can help scare off birds. Obviously it doesn't work 100% of the time, but it works enough that the atlas moths that looked more like snakes in the past, their ancestors who looked more like snakes, were less likely to be eaten and were more likely to have babies that looked, again, more like snakes. Because, this doesn't happen purposefully, right? It looks like maybe it did. These wingtips on this atlas moth, they really look like two snake heads. And what's even cooler is that the atlas moth, when it's resting, it waves its wings around in a specific way that makes them look like the snakes are moving, like a snake would move, not like how a moth wing would move, but how like a snake would move. This does not happen purposefully whatsoever. The atlas moth doesn't know, it has a little moth brain. It doesn't know what a snake looks like. It can't influence what its wings look like because it can't even see its wing. Its wings are back behind its head. It can't influence what its wings look like. It doesn't know what a snake looks like. It doesn't know that birds are afraid of snakes, but it ends up starting to look like a snake because over millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, the moths that had wingtips that sort of resembled snakes would get eaten less and would have more babies. And so then every generation, the moths start to look more and more like snakes just by chance and by the predation getting rid of the ones that don't look like snakes because they're all getting eaten before they can have babies. So that's kind of like the central principle of evolution, is that the adaptations and the mutations happen by chance, but then some of them are favorable and get passed down and exaggerated until you end up with something like we have with Atlas moths now, where their wingtips look like snakes. And mimicry is a really cool, biological phenomenon where animals look like other animals to either help them, get mates or help them hide from predators. So definitely read about mimicry biology, because it's really, really cool. And it's so fascinating to me how you can get something like this that looks so much like a snake on a moth that doesn't know what its wings look like, doesn't know what a snake looks like, doesn't know that birds are afraid of snakes, but then it evolves to look like this. So that's a cool example of how predation influences evolution. Another selective pressure is your environment. And, every environment has different factors that are going to affect the animals and plants that live there differently. And that includes like temperature, seasons, weather, things like that. So an example is the Alaskan wood frog that has evolved to be able to freeze itself during winter and not die because it lives in Alaska where it gets cold. And usually most species of frogs cannot survive a hard freeze. They would die when their bodies freeze. But the Alaskan wood frog can survive being frozen for weeks, months, and thaws out in the spring and is totally fine. And so their chemistry in their bodies works in such a way that even when they're frozen, they're still alive and functioning. And they've evolved to have that trait just because of the environment that they live in. If they couldn't survive a freeze, they would die. So the ones that could survive live and can, survive, their offspring can survive longer and longer freezes. Sean says antifreeze in their blood. Yes, they have antifreeze in their blood. So that's, a really cool example of a creature's environment affecting some of its traits and how it survives. Sexual selection. This is the superb bird of paradise. Birds are really cool examples of sexual selection. You can look at the birds outside in your yard and know that, you can see that the male birds are colorful and flashy. The female birds are not. And the reason for this is that the female birds of a lot of species of birds are very choosy in terms of what male they will mate with. And different species of birds like seeing different things in their mates. And so, you can evolve to get something really ridiculous like this in the superb bird of paradise, where not only does he have this ridiculous, feather configuration, he also has this display that he does for the female that's accentuated by his feathers. His wing flaring, his dancing. This is all to attract the female and convince her to mate with him. And so, yeah, there are lots of examples of sexual selection in birds. Rhonda says peafowl. Yeah, peafowl is a really good example. You got the male peacocks with the big tails. That is a result of sexual selection. You got cardinals where the males are red. Female cardinals like a specific shade of red. And so that's why males that are not quite that specific shade of red, they don't get mated with as much, and so they don't make as many babies. So the shade of red gets more and more specific with every, kind of generation.
And if I can bring something up since we're on this about it, and a lot of humans, let's say, go, well, that's different. That the men are the males are the flashy ones, because in most human societies it's reversed. But in a lot of ways, the female of the species is better served by staying hidden, and the males are nearly are more expendable. So it's not as big of a problem if they are, predated upon to a higher degree, as long as the females are more well protected.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. That's why, with things like this, the females end up being kind of drab and brown and small, is because it's better if they stay hidden, because being flashy, it comes with drawbacks, which is an increased chance of being preyed upon and eaten. So, if the females are the ones that lay the eggs. And so, if the male can mate with a female in time before he gets preyed upon and she gets away, his genes are still passed down. And so, he is still contributing to the next generation of those birds and making the next generation more flashy. Even if he gets eaten the instant after he leaves that female, he's done the deed. He's done it. He's passed on his genes. So, that's, yeah. And Sean says males can expend their energy for display, females use their energy for production. That's true too. It's all about, energy expenditures. And, females even, particularly in birds, but also in other species, can tell which males are healthier also based on their display, because like Sean mentioned with energy expenditures, males that have a lot of parasites that are sick, they're putting more energy expenditure into fighting the parasites and fighting the viruses or whatever that's making them sick. And so their displays don't look as nice as a male who is healthy. So that all kind of plays into that sexual selection. Yeah, humans are a little bit backwards. Most animals that show extreme sexual dimorphism, the male is the flashy one and the female is not. So, I mean, even lions, the male is flashy. He's got the big mane, whereas the females are just big cats. They look like house cats, just on a bigger scale.
And Anna, let me say this as well.
Yeah.
It's cultural too. It's like, this is us now. At other points in human history, it has been reversed, that the male was the one that would be more flashy.
Yeah. And I mean, there are still some human cultures where men put on, quote, displays, shows, dances to help them attract wives.
Boxing, sports, absolutely.
I mean, yeah, I think women might argue that, the boxing and sports, depending on who you are as a woman, it might be a turn off rather than a turn on. But yeah.
Let's say this. So it can be attracting males and females in this society.
Yeah. So the last selective pressure that I kind of want to talk about is resource availability. So to talk about this, I'm going to use a very classic example that every biology student ever has learned about. So this is a very classic example. This is your kind of book case of resource availability affecting evolution. So this is Darwin's finches. So Charles Darwin, he came up with the theory of natural selection. And in order to come up with this theory, he did a lot of research. He traveled around the world looking for examples of, evolution to play into his study. So on the Galapagos Islands, he found finches who lived there. And there were like 18 or so species that, because they lived on these remote islands, the Galapagos Islands are very remote. Even today, it's difficult to get there. These finches were isolated from other populations of finches. And isolation is a factor that can really drive evolution and divergence of species, because when one population of a species or one, subset of a population becomes isolated from the other, they can't pass genes back and forth anymore. And so these two populations that are now isolated from each other are going to evolve separately from each other over millions of years. And so they might become something very different over time. So these finches, they're thought to have come from a single common ancestor. And when I say a single common ancestor, I don't mean a single bird. I mean a single species where a small population was probably blown to the Galapagos Islands during a hurricane. They got caught in the winds and they got blown from the mainland all the way to the Galapagos. And then once they were there, they started experiencing what's called adaptive radiation, where they started evolving to utilize different food sources. And you can see that in the graphic here. So the main difference between these species of finches, these 18 species of finches, is their beak size and shape. So their beak morphology. They're mostly the same in terms of, their color, their size, whatever. It's really their beaks that are different. And their different beaks allow them to utilize different food sources. And, this happened over time because on an island, food is scarce. And so, your population can only get so big because, once you get too big and there's not enough food, you start to die out. So their population could only get so big if they only relied on the one food source. If they could only eat insects, then there's only so many insects for them to eat, especially on an island. So over time, the birds who had slightly different beaks that allowed them to eat different food sources, those traits were like good to have. Being able to eat a cactus instead of a bug was a really good adaptation to have, because when bugs were scarce, you could go eat cactuses where your friends couldn't, and your friends would starve, but you would live, and so you would have babies. And your babies would have beaks that better allowed them to eat the cactuses that allowed you to survive, because you're passing on those genes and those traits to the next generation. So over millions of years, this single species of finch evolved into 18 or so different species that utilize different specific food sources and can all coexist on this island and have if you take all of them together, you can have more birds of these 18 different species that eat different things than you could have of the one bird who can all only eat the same thing. So this divergence in beak forms allowed them to access different food sources, which we call ecological niches. And ecological niches, we'll talk about that in a second. But this allowed them to access different food sources, which increased their survival. All right, so we're getting toward the end, and I think I only have a couple more slides. So another really cool biological principle that you can kind of think about is coevolution, which is where species that share an environment evolve together, especially if they're, interacting with each other, or, they depend on each other for certain things. And coevolution leads to really interesting symbioses between species. I mentioned parasitism for mutualism. So there's kind of three main categories of how species interact with each other. That's parasitism, where one species benefits and the other species is hurt by the interaction. There's commensalism, where one species benefits and the other species isn't really affected. And then there's mutualism, where both species benefit from the interaction. And these interactions between species can be very species specific. So there are certain plants that are only pollinated by certain insects. And if the plant doesn't have that insect, then it can't be pollinated naturally. Or if that insect doesn't have that plant, then it might not have a food source. And so it would die. So this is why planting native plants is important. So I'm not going to get on my soapbox about that, because I could get on my soapbox for a long time. But go plant native plants in your yard. They're important. Important for our local insects. So one really cool example of coevolution is ghost orchids, and that's what's in my picture here. So when the ghost orchid was discovered, scientists found that the nectar of the flower was down this really long kind of tube of the flower. And you can see it in the picture here, it's just kind of hanging off. The nectar is down in the bottom of that long tube of the flower. And so scientists discovered it, and they're like, man, what could possibly pollinate this thing? We don't know of any insects that have any kind of proboscis, tongue long enough to pollinate this flower. Why would this possibly be beneficial? Blah, blah, blah. Well, then they finally discovered a particular moth species that does have a proboscis long enough to pollinate the ghost flower, or the ghost orchid. And then just a few years ago, pollination was caught on video for the very first time. So they weren't sure, for decades, scientists were not sure whether this moth pollinated this flower, because they'd never seen it happen. But they thought that it probably did, because, its proboscis is long enough. So this is probably what we've been looking for, however long. But now they finally caught it on camera. And so we know for sure that, yes, there's a specific species of moth that does have a proboscis long enough to pollinate this orchid. Another kind of cool example of this is avocados. Avocados were really dependent on the giant ground sloth from South America that existed in South America, during the last ice age. Avocados were dependent on the giant ground sloth for dispersal, because that was the only mammal with a digestive tract large enough to pass an avocado pit through it. So the giant ground sloths would eat the avocado, and then they'd walk somewhere, and then they'd drop the avocado pit after it had passed through their digestive tract, and then the new avocado tree could grow in a new place. So the only reason, since the giant ground sloths went extinct, avocados didn't have any method of seed dispersal, because no other mammal was in that region was large enough to pass the seed through their digestive system. So the only reason that avocados still exist today is because of people, because we like them, and so we cultivate them.
Anna, can I hop in right here, because I see coevolution, but I am very interested in this little section that you have right here, and I had to go Google exactly what the name of it is, because I had written that thing about like sandworm survival and stuff. Yeah. And it was like you're saying about the avocados have lost the reason why they are currently the same way. Yeah. And that is let's see here, evolutionary anachronism. And another example I see right here is the bottle palms of Mascarene Islands, which are toxic to literally almost every animal at all, except for giant tortoises. And giant tortoises do not live on this island, have not been on this island for hundreds and hundreds of years, but they were the seed dispersal for this plant a long time ago. And now it's like, oh, that's a toxic plant. But the reason why is lost to history.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that where, a species had a very close evolutionary connection with another one, and then one of those species went extinct, and somehow the partner species, if it either finds a way to survive or it goes extinct as well. So there are a lot of examples of that in nature where this one species in the partnership is gone, and we don't know, we have to do some scientific digging to figure out, like, why this plant looks the way it does, or why this animal likes to eat the things it eats, and that kind of thing. So it's really interesting to think about. It would be really lonely, I think, to be an avocado tree without the giant ground sloth before humans came along. It would be lonely. It's like, oh, my partner is gone. But Rhonda mentions that similar is true of pawpaw trees and fruit. They have to be partly digested to germinate. There are a lot of plants that have to be partly digested to germinate. There are a lot of plants that require fire for their seeds to germinate. And so, when we prevent forest fires from happening, we are suppressing a lot of native species that require that regular fire for their seeds to be able to grow. And also, suppressing forest fires leads to other problems, which is bigger fires. So there's also that. But yeah, there's a lot of these interesting interactions and, requirements that go on in the natural world that, we don't really tend to think about on a day-to-day basis. Just some other factors to finish us off. I already other factors that impact evolution. I already talked about population isolation or overlap. And, these things can be affected by geology or weather, things like that. And when two populations of the same species are isolated, they will start to diverge from each other because they cannot exchange genes anymore. And then if two populations come back together, the question is whether they can still produce viable offspring or not, if they've been separated too long for them to be able to do that. And I briefly mentioned ecological niches. This would be things like the food source that a creature utilizes, or a particular character of the environment. Some species like to burrow in muddy rivers, and that would be their ecological niche, is they're burrowing in this muddy river. And so if the muddy river goes away, the species goes away too. And some ecological niches are robust, some are very fragile. So you'll get some species that only eat one specific thing, and if that specific thing leaves, that species is going to be gone too. You get other species that are more generalist, where their niche is like, I'll eat anything. You get like a raccoon. They'll eat anything. They can exist anywhere. Their ecological niche is very robust. You get things like invasive species. Does anyone know what this picture is of? Any guesses?
Looks like my backyard.
Sorry, what?
Georgia, a kudzu.
Yes, this is kudzu. This is the vine that ate the South. This kudzu is an invasive species. It's from Southeast Asia. It was imported to the United States, I believe, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the government encouraged farmers to plant kudzu to help with erosion, not knowing that it would do this. It doesn't have, so plants are a little bit different than animals. The things that, affect them are more invisible. You have different fungus and bacteria in the soil that affect how plants grow. So when kudzu was imported over here, the bacteria and fungi that, kind of slow its growth in its natural habitat don't exist here. And, the animals that eat kudzu in its natural habitat don't exist here. And so it goes wild. The weather and temperature is like the perfect environment for it. And so it just grows, and it grows over everything. I saw a picture when I was looking for pictures. I saw a picture of it completely engulfing a house. It grows over everything. And it has been a really big ecological problem in Georgia and Alabama, states where it was, and like the southeast region where it was heavily planted. So this is what an invasive species can do when it's brought to a new environment. Keystone species are species that are very important for a specific ecosystem to exist the way it does. For example, beavers are sometimes considered keystone species because they are ecosystem engineers. They building their dams, they change the environment from, they'll see a creek, right? And they'll be like, I like that creek, but I wish there was a lake there. That's not really what beavers think, but that's whatever. They build their dam over a creek. And then behind the dam, upstream from the dam, the creek becomes a lake. And over time, right? And then when the lake is there, you can have other species of fish that come into the lake. You can have other species of birds that utilize the lake, like waterfowl and things like that would not prefer a stream but enjoy the lake being there. But then if you get rid of the beavers, then the lake goes away. And so then all those species that have come in go away. So beavers are often considered to be keystone species because of how important they can be in specific environments to allow other species to live there. So there are a lot of factors. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of factors that influence, evolution and, how species look and act and whatever. But these are just some things that you can consider if you're looking into creating like kind of realistic speculative biology. These are things that you can think about and invent species based on these principles. So just some main takeaways, because I know I'm running over time and I'm really sorry. But some main takeaways is that speculative biology is a fun world building tool that's based on science, helps your worlds feel more vibrant and real. You do not have to be a biologist to create realistic speculative biology. You just have to have an interest and the internet and do a little bit of brain work. It's a good exercise, a good creative exercise to think about. So that's all that I have. I do see a question in the chat. Rhonda asks about climate change. Mammals will get smaller, insects and arachnids, etc. will get larger. Is that correct? Not necessarily. We do have examples in the past of when our atmosphere had a different composition, higher carbon dioxide composition, where insects were larger. We had some giant dragonflies and giant spiders and things like that running around that we don't have anymore. That won't necessarily happen again. It really just depends on a lot of different factors. And honestly, right now, human activity is a really big driver toward climate change that will start affecting, how species evolve and things like that. So it's kind of hard to say what will happen. A lot of species will go extinct because they cannot survive the high temperatures start seeing, and not just higher temperatures, but also more severe weather. And that's kind of the main thing, is that weather patterns are going to become more severe, more weird. You're going to have a lot more violent temperature swings. And there are a lot of species who can't survive things like that because their ecological niche is not robust enough to survive across that broader range of temperatures and weather that they're going to start experiencing. So that's the first thing that we're going to see is mass extinctions. And we're already starting to see it. There's already lots of species, particularly in the tropics, that are historically very species diverse, but we're already starting to lose a lot of species, particularly in the tropics due to climate change.
And if I can bring something up about that writ large, the idea of what happens when there is a large die-off, when there is like a big extinction event, as we're kind of living through right now, is very interesting and is explored very well in After Earth. Because that author goes on about like a whole bunch of different things passed away. Like, let's say all the dogs are gone and all the wolves are gone as well. So some cat relative grows up to be like a larger species and fill that ecological niche. So if we're talking about, like this is over a long time period or something like that, when the dinosaurs were around, there were mammals, but they were not very diverse and they only fit their very small ecological niches. And then after the dinosaurs were gone, all of a sudden diversity exploded among mammals because that's what was left. So let's say humans in this right now, unfortunately, get rid of a lot of mammals, get rid of a lot of birds, and the temperature rises all over the earth. We may have a explosion of new insects that can fit those ecological niches that yes, mosquitoes and roaches of unusual size, taking up the ecological niches that were left behind.
Yeah, we are already seeing their ranges change. There are mosquito species that used to live only in like South America that are moving north into regions that are now favorable for them because they don't freeze as much as they used to, and so those mosquitoes can survive. We also are seeing ranges of birds and trees even start to shift as it gets warmer. A lot of them are shifting toward cooler environments to try to, where they can survive better. So yeah, we're gonna see a lot of extinction, a lot of range shifts. But again, this is all happening over like the range shifts and the extinctions happen faster than the actual change. So like range shifts can happen over decades. We could see that happen over a human lifetime. We could see an extinction happen over maybe 2 or 3 human lifetimes, depending on how big the population was to begin with. An actual change in a species, that would be over many thousands of human lifetimes. It happens very, very, very slowly. But, there are like little small changes that are happening all the time, right? So, but having a dragonfly species, right, become multiple different dragonfly species, that is going to happen over a long time. We do happen to live in a time period where we have seen that divergence or very recent evidence of that kind of divergence happening between species, but no single person could watch something like that happen over their lifetime. That's all. Because it just happens over such vast timescales. The timescales are really interesting to me to think about, both in terms of evolution and in terms of geology, because it's just so vast. So let's see. Aranda, you mentioned that we're in a different kind of isolated range in Appalachia, which is really interesting to me because I'm from Alabama, which is in the foothill. I'm from North Alabama, which is the very foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And I went to college in Alabama, and we learned about how Alabama, these very foothills of the Appalachians, were during the last ice age, were a glacial refuge for a lot of amphibian species. So again, most amphibian species cannot survive a hard freeze or extremely cold temperatures. But in the foothills of these Appalachians in North Alabama, the amphibians were able to, go higher up in the elevation and take refuge from these glaciers that were covering the land below and be able to survive. And so Alabama is actually known as a hotspot of amphibian diversity for that reason. So anyway, that's all. But yeah, so if anyone has any other questions, I'm happy to answer it. I know we're like 20 minutes over, but yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. But if there are no other questions, thanks for coming. I hope that this was interesting.
Definitely interesting. And I'm going to hold up this as well, which is a book I've read recently, a 60s Pollinators of Eden, which is sentient plants, while not exactly conscious on another planet, have evolved to be able to move and reproduce, and they co-evolve with humans. And so it's very interesting how
there you go.
They depend on reproduction by using humans.
Yeah.
I also want to bring up as well that next week we're going to have adjective battle. We'll have a battle of adjectives. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they terrible? Are they absolutely necessary? And that should be fun. And I want everybody to bring their opinions about adjectives as we go through the good, the bad, and the ugly.
All right. Thanks, Sean. And thanks for coming, everybody. I appreciate y'all being here and, listening to me gush about biology. So thanks for coming, and we hope to see y'all next week.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.